Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. If you are new here, settle in. This channel exists for one reason: to make history feel the way it actually was. Not the textbook version. Not the lecture version. Not the version where someone stands at a whiteboard and draws arrows at a timeline. The version where you were there, breathing the same air, standing in the same long shadow that time casts over everything eventually. Tonight, we are going somewhere that is not particularly comfortable. We are going to spend time inside one of the more complicated corners of American history. The part that does not appear on the coins, does not appear in the patriotic songs, and does not get a whole lot of space on the guided tours of famous government buildings. We are going to talk about punishment. Specifically, punishment in 20th century America. The real kind. The kind that happened in the fields and the prison cells and the execution chambers and the basement rooms of institutions that had names like reformatories and training schools and state hospitals. Names that were doing a significant amount of diplomatic work on behalf of the things that actually happened inside them. Here's the thing that most people assume when they picture American justice. They picture something that looks like a courtroom, marble columns, a gavel, a judge in robes, the dignified architecture of law. They picture something that, whatever its flaws, is at least recognizable as a system trying to be civilized. That image is not entirely wrong. The system was trying. It has always been trying. The trying is real. But the gap between the image and reality was, for much of the 20th century, very wide. And in that gap, things happened that the country preferred not to look at directly. Things that were documented by reformers and journalists and former prisoners and federal commissions. Things that changed slowly, incompletely, and at enormous human cost. This is a story of that gap. Before we go further, if this kind of slow, careful, historical storytelling is something you enjoy, a like and a subscribe means more than you might think. It helps more people find this little corner of the internet where history and sleep peacefully coexist, which is a combination you would not have thought worked until you tried it. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Whether you are in a cold bedroom somewhere in the Midwest with an extra blanket pulled up, or sitting on a couch in the South with a fan running. I want to know. Now, dim the lights if you have not already done so. Set your phone face down somewhere close enough to reach, but far enough not to tempt you. Adjust the pillow so the back of your neck is comfortable. Take a slow, deliberate breath into your nose and let it out through your mouth. We are going back, all the way back to the very beginning of the century, to a country that genuinely believed it had figured out what civilized punishment was supposed to look like. A country that had built courthouses with Greek columns and prisons with thick stone walls, and a theory of justice it called modern, progressive, and humane. A country that was, in many specific and documentable ways, deeply mistaken about all three of those things. Let us begin. You are standing at the edge of a dirt road somewhere in Alabama. The year is 1902. You know it is Alabama because of the red clay at the road's edge, the specific terracotta red that is peculiar to the deep South, the kind of color that stains your boots and your cuffs and reminds you, every time you look down, exactly where you are. The morning air still holds a suggestion of last night's coolness, but only a suggestion. By 9 o'clock, that suggestion will have been thoroughly overruled. America in 1902 is a country in the middle of its own mythology. The frontier is officially closed, declared so by the Census Bureau in 1890, though the West is still wild in ways the Declaration did not account for. The industrial cities of the North are growing at a speed that astonishes visitors from Europe, who come expecting a provincial cousin and find something loud and ambitious and not entirely sure of itself. The South is in a different chapter entirely. The Civil War ended 37 years ago, which sounds like a long time until you meet someone who was 15 years old when it ended, and who is now 52 and still working the same land. The country is young in some ways and very old in others. Its justice system is one of the old parts. When the 20th century opened, the American criminal justice system was not really a system in the modern sense. It was a collection of habits, traditions, inherited assumptions, and local arrangements that varied enormously from one state to the next, one county to the next, one judge to the next. Some states had professional police forces. Some relied on elected sheriffs, whose qualifications were primarily electoral rather than professional. Some cities had courts that functioned with procedural rigor. Others at courts where the outcome could often be predicted by who you knew and what you owned. What most of these arrangements shared was a foundational set of beliefs about what crime meant and what punishment was supposed to accomplish. Crime was a moral failure. Punishment was a response to moral failure. The nature of the response should communicate the seriousness of the failure. And the people who had failed morally had, in some meaningful sense, put themselves outside the ordinary protections of civilization. They had forfeited something. That last belief was the one that mattered most, because it was a belief that made everything else possible. When you believe that a person who has committed a crime has forfeited their membership in the community of people who deserve careful treatment, you create a category of person to whom ordinary standards of care and decency do not apply. You create a population that can be worked without regard for their well-being. A population that can be confined in conditions that would be considered outrageous anywhere else. A population that can be hurt in controlled and uncontrolled ways without the hurt being seen as a problem requiring urgent attention. The 20th century built an enormous amount of machinery on top of that belief. And we're going to walk through all of it slowly without rushing, because rushing is how you miss the important parts. The Red Clay Road in Alabama is a good place to start, because what is about to happen on that road is one of the most significant and least discussed features of early American punishment. A group of men is coming around the bend. They are moving slowly, not because they are tired yet, though they will be, but because of the iron. The chains on their ankles weigh roughly 2 pounds each, and the connecting chain between each pair of men has about 3 feet of slack in it, which means you walk in a specific shuffling rhythm that is not quite your own rhythm. That is a rhythm imposed by the length of iron between you and the man ahead. You learn it quickly. Your body adapts because bodies are extraordinarily good at adapting, which is both the best thing about them and, in certain circumstances, a source of deep sadness. But before we walk the road, we need to spend some time in the courtroom where these men began their journey. Because the road and the courtroom are connected by a thread that was one of the defining moral failures of the century, and it is a thread that takes some unraveling. Close your eyes and picture a courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1904. The building is substantial. Brick, 2 stories, with modest portico and tall windows that let in generous light. Inside, the courtroom has high ceilings and wooden benches, and the slightly important smell of a room where official things happen. The judge's bench is elevated in the traditional way, reminding everyone who enters which direction power flows. A man is standing before the judge. He is young, perhaps 22. He is wearing the clothes he was arrested in, which were not especially good to begin with, and have not improved during whatever time he has spent in the county jail waiting for this moment. His name does not appear in the surviving records of this kind of case in the way that judges' names appear. He exists in this story as an example, which is how the system tended to see him too. He has been charged with vagrancy. Vagrancy, in case you are unfamiliar with it as a legal category, was essentially a crime that made it illegal to be poor in the wrong place at the wrong time. The vagrancy laws of the early 20th century southern states were not subtle about their function. They made it a criminal offense to be unemployed, to wander without a clear destination and a verifiable employment situation, to exist in a public space without being able to demonstrate that you were productively contributing to the economy in a manner the local authorities approved of. They were, in other words, laws designed to produce convictions of a specific population of people with extraordinary efficiency. And they worked. The hearing takes perhaps 6 minutes. There is no defense attorney. Or if there is one, he is a stranger to this man and has had no time to prepare anything. The judge considers the case and delivers the sentence. 12 months at hard labor. And then, before the sentence is fully echoed off the high ceiling of that brick courthouse, something happens that distinguishes this moment from what most people imagine when they imagine American justice. The convicted man is not taken to a state prison. He is handed over to a private company, a coal mining company, or a turpentine farm, or a railroad contractor laying track through the swampy lowlands south of Montgomery. The specific industry varies depending on what contracts were in place in this particular county at this particular time. This was convict leasing, and it was one of the most consequential and least comfortable parts of early American punishment history. The convict lease system did not begin in 1904. It had roots that went back directly to the end of the Civil War in 1865. The logic of it was perfectly clear to the people who designed it, if not to everyone who might observe it from the outside. Here was the situation. The southern states had an expensive prison system to maintain. They had a shortage of labor for large industrial and agricultural operations. And they had, through a set of laws that criminalized behaviors that had previously only applied to free people, a rapidly expanding prison population that could supply that labor. The Black Codes, as historians came to call the body of legislation passed by southern states in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, included laws against vagrancy, against loitering, against leaving an employer without written permission, against assembling in groups, against possessing firearms, and against numerous other behaviors that became criminal specifically because a formerly enslaved population was now legally free and therefore newly subject to criminal law. The laws were not subtle in their targets. Their application was immediate. Once a person was convicted under these laws, the state owned their labor for the duration of their sentence. The state then leased that labor to private companies for a daily fee. The company received a workforce it did not have to pay, a workforce it could use as intensively as production demanded, a workforce that had no legal recourse for conditions of employment because they were not employees but prisoners. The death rates in some convict lease camps during the 1880s and 1890s were breathtaking, not in a good way. The mortality rate in some camps in certain years approached 25%. 1 in 4 people did not survive a year of this. They died of overwork, of diseases that swept through overcrowded, poorly ventilated barracks, of malnutrition, of the violence of guards who operated with essentially no oversight, of accidents in mines and on construction sites where safety was not a consideration that the contract addressed. By 1900, some of this was beginning to attract attention, not primarily because of the human suffering, which had been going on for decades, but because it was starting to look, even to observers who were fairly comfortable with racial inequality, uncomfortably like the institution that the country had fought a war to end 35 years earlier. The metaphor was too direct. The resemblance was too close. Journalists started writing about it. A federal report in 1904 used language that was careful and bureaucratic, and still somehow managed to convey that conditions in the camps it had inspected were not compatible with the America the country said it was. The formal abolition of convict leasing moved at the pace of molasses, going uphill in January. Alabama abolished it in 1928 after decades of pressure. Mississippi, the last state to formally end it, did so in 1940. That year is worth sitting with for a moment. 1940. The year Germany invaded France and Britain stood alone in Europe, and America was preparing to enter the greatest war of the century. Mississippi was still formally operating a system of forced prison labor leased to private companies. These histories overlap in ways that are uncomfortable to hold in your mind simultaneously, but holding them is the honest thing to do. Even as the formal leasing arrangements were dismantled, the conditions that defined them did not simply vanish. They moved. They transformed. They found new legal containers. And many of them moved onto the roads. Settle, and a little more. The sun is getting higher on that Alabama road. The men in the chain are starting their second hour of work. We should walk with them for a while. You are on the shoulder of a Georgia County road, and it is the summer of 1915. The heat here is not the heat of a warm day. It is the heat of a deliberate presence, something that arrived around 8 in the morning and has been making itself increasingly at home ever since. By now, mid-morning, it sits on the tops of your shoulders and the back of your neck with the specific weight of something that intends to stay. The road itself is the project. Everything around you is the project. A crew of between 25 and 35 men is strung out along the road's edge, working on drainage and grading and the application of crushed rock that will make this stretch of Georgia farmland passable in all seasons instead of just the dry ones. Georgia, like most southern states, was engaged in the early decades of the 20th century in a massive program of rural road improvement, motivated by the same progressive-era enthusiasm for infrastructure that was paving and macadamizing and otherwise improving roads all across America. The difference was who was doing the paving. The men on this road are connected to one another at the ankles by an iron chain. Each link of the connecting chain weighs enough that you feel it with every step, a gentle but persistent reminder that your movement is not entirely your own. The chain has 3 feet of slack between each man. which is enough to work and enough to walk, but not enough to forget that you are part of a connected whole, that your rhythm is not entirely your rhythm, that if the man ahead of you stumbles, you will know it immediately. The chain gang was a road version of the punishment system, where convict leasing sent men to private companies. The chain gang served the public, specifically the public's need for transportation infrastructure, roads, drainage ditches, bridges, land clearing on public lands. The work was done by men who had been sentenced by county courts and assigned to county chain gang operations, a separate system from the state prison in many jurisdictions. A county chain gang in Georgia in 1915 was run with a minimum of administrative complexity. The sheriff's office or a designated county superintendent oversaw the operation. Guards called bosses or riding bosses, depending on whether the supervision happened from horseback or on foot, maintained discipline and pace. The prisoners lived and moved with the work. Living arrangements for chain gang prisoners in this era were primarily the rolling cage. The rolling cage was exactly what the name suggests. A cage made of wood and iron bars, mounted on wagon wheels, pulled from one worksite to the next by horses or mules as the road project moved along. When the day's work was done and the evening light had gone thick and orange over the pines, the prisoners climbed into the cage. Guards locked it from the outside. The cage measured roughly 20 feet long and 8 feet wide. If you had 30 prisoners, you were doing the math of a space that modern humans would find deeply upsetting at a camping retreat, let alone as a primary sleeping arrangement for weeks at a time. Inside the rolling cage, particularly in summer, the heat was its own punishment. The cage trapped the residual warmth of the day and held it close to you all night. Would absorbed and released heat in ways that were not favorable to sleep. The sound were the sounds of 30 men in a small space. Breathing, shifting, coughing. The low murmur of conversation that was permitted in some camps and forbidden in others depending on the superintendent's personal philosophy. Permanent camp arrangements existed too, where the road project was long enough to justify building barracks. These were wooden structures, usually behind barbed wire, usually with slightly better ventilation than the rolling cage. Slightly. The sanitation at both types of arrangement was a recurring problem. Outhouses were the standard solution, and outhouses for 30 or more men at a rural work site required maintenance that was not always reliably provided. Dysentery, skin infections, respiratory illness were the consistent companions of chain gang life. The food in a chain gang camp was nutritionally adequate in terms of calories, because men doing hard physical labor all day will stop doing hard physical labor effectively if they do not receive enough fuel, and this was understood by superintendents in a practical, if not a compassionate way. The specific composition of the calories was another matter. Cornbread, dried beans, salt pork, sweet potatoes in season. The combination was high energy and low variety, which sounds fine in theory, and becomes considerably less fine around week 4 when you have eaten the same 4 things for every meal of every day with no indication that anything will change. Pellagra was a serious medical problem throughout southern chain gang camps and prisons for the first several decades of the century. Pellagra is caused by a deficiency of niacin, a B vitamin, and it presents with a constellation of symptoms that were given by early 20th century physicians who observed it. The 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. The skin develops a distinctive scaly rash, particularly on areas exposed to sunlight. The digestive system becomes unreliable in ways that are unpleasant to detail, but that represent significant additional suffering for men already having a difficult time. In advanced stages, neurological symptoms appear, and then, untreated, the process arrives at its logical terminus. Pellagra was treatable once the niacin connection was understood, which began to be established in the 19-teens and was confirmed through the 1920s. The actual provision of niacin-rich foods in sufficient quantities to chain gang prisoners took considerably longer to implement than the scientific understanding required. Understanding a problem and choosing to fix it are, historically, different things. Discipline on the chain gang was administered by the bosses with broad discretion and limited oversight. Physical punishment was standard, documented, and in some counties regulated by written rules that specified maximum numbers of strokes, required a witness, and demanded that the severity correspond to the nature of the infraction. These regulations were the kind of thing that looked good written down and was somewhat optimistically enforced in practice. The most common punishment was flogging, administered with a leather strap to the back or buttocks of a prisoner restrained over a barrel or a wooden frame. The number of strokes delivered varied by the severity of the infraction as the boss understood it, by the boss's temperament, and by how the morning had gone generally. Some chain gang bosses were, by historical account, relatively restrained in their use of physical punishment. Others were not. The documentation is patchy because the documentation was kept by the same system administering the punishment, which is not an arrangement that typically produces thorough self-criticism. Prisoners who attempted to escape and were recaptured face additional shackling, heavier chains, hobbles that restricted stride, and in some camps, the sweat box, a small wooden or metal enclosure set in direct sunlight in which a prisoner could be confined for hours or days, was a principal punishment for serious infractions. The temperatures inside a sweat box in a Georgia summer could reach levels that the human body is not designed to manage well. This was presumably the point. The Georgia sweat box was not unique to Georgia. Variations of it appeared across southern chain gang and prison camp operations under various names. Box, doghouse, hot box. The names had a certain grim creativity that the conditions they described did not entirely merit. The formal chain gang in its classic form, with the connecting iron chain between prisoners working on public roads, began to decline in the 1930s and 1940s as reform pressure built. Georgia Governor Ellis Arnold made a significant contribution to that decline when he abolished the county chain gang system and consolidated it under state authority in 1946, alongside broader prison reforms. Other states followed, though at varying speeds. By the 1950s and 60s, the image of men in striped uniforms connected by iron chains on southern roads had largely passed out of American practice, though not out of American memory or American cultural vocabulary. Some states brought back versions of the chain gang in the 1990s, during the punitive expansion of the mass incarceration era, in response to what certain politicians described as the coddling of prisoners. Alabama reinstituted chain gangs in 1995. The iron connecting chains were not used, but the labor on public roads under armed supervision was restarted. It lasted a few years before being ended again. The mockingbird in the pines along the road's edge sings its complicated borrowed repertoire, indifferent to the human arrangements below it. It is borrowing from the songs of other birds, singing things that are not originally its own, making something new from pieces of other lives. There is no metaphor here. It is just a bird, but it is a very good singer. Now, the road is one kind of punishment, but most of the story of American punishment happens inside walls. Let us go inside. You step through the gate, and it closes behind you. The gate is iron, set into a stone wall that your eye follows upward to somewhere between 15 and 20 feet, before reaching the top. On the top of the wall, at intervals, there are guard towers, structures with enough elevation to see everything in the yard below. The year is 1923. The prison could be in Ohio, or Illinois, or New York, or Pennsylvania. The specific state is less important than the fact that American prison architecture in this era had converged on a set of forms that look remarkably similar wherever they appeared. The smell arrives before anything else. Prison smell in 1923 is a compound thing. Start with the industrial disinfectant that the cleaning crews use on the floors of the cell blocks, a carbolic acid-based product that is meant to kill bacteria and succeeds at this, and also at making the air in enclosed spaces smell like a hospital that has had an argument with a chemical plant. Add to that the smell of cooked food, specifically the institutional cooking smell of large quantities of the same few things prepared in large pots for a very large number of people. Add to that the smell of a great many bodies in a confined space with limited access to bathing facilities and limited ventilation. Not a filthy smell exactly, but human smell, the smell of crowded humanity that no amount of institutional cleaning product quite addresses. And underneath all of that, something that is harder to name, the smell of time, of days and years accumulating in stone and iron with no ability to leave. The cell blocks are the dominant architectural feature. The Auburn system, named for the New York prison that popularized in the 1820s and which remained the standard model for American prison construction through at least the first half of the 20th century, arranged cells in long tiers along a central spine. Imagine a very wide corridor high-ceilinged, with cells opening off both sides in rows stacked 3 or 4 stories high, connected by iron catwalks and accessed by iron stairs. The whole thing designed so that a guard standing at the central point could see down both directions of the corridor and could, in theory, observe multiple tiers simultaneously. Each cell was small. Exact dimensions varied by institution, but the common range was 7 feet deep, 4 feet wide, 7 feet high, 7 by 4. If you're lying in your bed right now and you want to understand that dimension, your bed is probably somewhere between 6 and 7 feet long and around 4 feet wide, if it's a full or double. So imagine your sleeping space exactly as it is, but with a wall behind your head and a wall behind your feet and walls on both sides, and no windows except possibly a narrow slit, and a solid metal door with a slot at the bottom for the passing of meal trays. That is the cell. That is the whole cell. That is, for many prisoners in the 1920s and 30s, home for years. The prison of this era had rules. This is not a surprising statement, but the density and specificity of the rules deserve some attention. The Auburn system had been built around the philosophy of complete silence. The founders of the Auburn approach believed, with genuine conviction, that criminal behavior was a product of bad social associations, that criminals had been corrupted by contact with other criminals and with criminal subculture, and that the antidote to this corruption was a removal of all social contact. Silence. Isolation within communal spaces. Prisoners working in the same room, but forbidden to communicate. Eating together without speaking. Marching in step without talking. The theory was that stripped of the social fabric of criminality, a man's conscience would have nothing to argue against and would naturally assert itself. The strict silence rule proved impossible to maintain at scale. By the early 20th century, most institutions had abandoned the absolute prohibition on speech. Prisoners could talk in certain spaces at certain times under certain conditions. But the physical infrastructure built to support silence remained. The cells, the surveillance, the architecture of control. And in place of silence, an extraordinarily dense rule book. Rules about when you could stand and when you were required to sit. Rules about the direction of traffic in corridors. Rules about what you were permitted to keep in your cell and how it was required to be arranged. Because wardens conducted inspections and cells were required to meet specific standards of orderliness. Rules about what you could say to a guard and what forms of address were required. Rules about meal lines and work assignments and the use of the yard during recreation periods and lights out at night. And what happened if you were not in your bunk when the count was taken. Infractions of these rules produced formal responses. Most prisons in this era had a disciplinary system that began with a report written by a guard, proceeded to a brief hearing before a deputy warden or captain of the guards, and resulted in one of several possible punishments. Loss of good time, meaning that the days that would have counted toward an early release were canceled and the sentence effectively lengthened. Reduction or elimination of privileges, meaning no time in the yard, no access to whatever limited reading material was available. Solitary confinement, which we will spend considerable time in later in this story, or corporal punishment, which we will address in the next chapter. What made the disciplinary system particularly significant was that it operated with essentially no external oversight. There was no appeal beyond the warden. There was no legal representation for the prisoner. There was no mechanism for contacting outside authorities if you believed the punishment was unjust or excessive. The prison was a closed system, and what happened inside the closed system was, to an extraordinary degree, entirely up to the people running it. Wardens had enormous discretionary power in this era. A warden could determine the daily regime of the institution almost entirely independently. He could authorize or prohibit forms of punishment. He could determine work assignments, diet, access to medical care, the temperature of the cells in winter, the ventilation of the cells in summer, the staffing levels of the guard force, the training and conduct of that guard force. He was, in his institution, something very close to absolute sovereign. This meant that the experience of imprisonment in 1923 America varied wildly depending on where you were and who the warden was. A humane administrator who believed in the possibility of genuine rehabilitation and who ran a disciplined but not cruel institution was a very different experience from a warden who believed that breaking a man's spirit was a first step toward correcting his character. Both types existed. The range between them was very wide, and there was no reliable mechanism for ensuring that any given institution fell on the more humane end of the spectrum. Medical care in this era was another dimension of institutional neglect. Prison medical facilities in the early 20th century were, with notable exceptions, rudimentary. The average prison in 1915 had a physician on staff or on call, but the qualifications of that physician varied. The medical equipment was minimal. The diagnostic tools were limited to what was available in a general practitioner's office of the era, which was itself considerably less than what we associate with medicine today. And the cultural attitude that prisoners did not deserve quality medical care, having forfeited their rights through their crimes, was pervasive enough to affect the priority that prison administrations placed on medical facilities. Tuberculosis was the dominant medical crisis in early 20th century American prisons. The combination of overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate nutrition, and physical stress created ideal conditions for the spread of the disease. Tuberculosis spread through the air, through the droplets produced by coughing and speaking, and in a crowded cell block with inadequate ventilation, those droplets went everywhere. Some institutions had tuberculosis mortality rates that would have prompted immediate emergency responses in any civilian hospital context. Inside prison walls, they were recorded, filed, and largely accepted as an inevitable feature of institutional life. The stone walls absorb everything. The history is in the walls. We have been here long enough that you can feel it. Let's talk about something more specific. Something that was not incidental to this system, but was a formal, documented, regulated part of it. Something that was debated in the professional journals of prison administrators. Not as to whether it should happen, but as to how it should be done correctly. Here is what a leather strap designed for prison use in 1925 looks like. It is about 18 inches long and 3 inches wide, made of thick cowhide that has been treated and hardened until it has a consistency of something between leather and wood. Some versions have a wooden handle wrapped in a leather grip. Some are a single piece. The weight of it in the hand is substantial enough that it is not going to slip or lose velocity between one end of stroke and the other. It is designed, in other words, to deliver a consistent and reliable amount of force to whatever surface it contacts. You probably did not expect a chapter about a piece of leather to begin with product specifications, but corporal punishment in American prisons was institutional enough in the first half of the 20th century that the equipment used had specifications. Some prisons had specific instruments approved for use and kept records of them. Some counties had regulations about the dimensions of the strap used in their chain gang operations. The bureaucratic treatment of the strap as an institutional tool rather than an instrument of uncontrolled violence was, in its way, one of the more revealing features of the era. Calling something a regulation width strap and keeping it in a specified cabinet and requiring that a medical officer be present before it was used made it sound administrative. It sounds less administrative the closer you look. Delaware is the institution that deserves particular attention here, not because it was uniquely cruel by the standards of its era, but because it was in certain ways exceptionally candid about what it was doing. Delaware had maintained a whipping post as a legal punishment since the colonial era, not just inside prisons, but as a public sentence. If a court in Delaware sentenced you to a whipping, you were taken to a post outside the courthouse, stripped to the waist, secured to the post, and flogged in view of whoever happened to be in the vicinity. The number of lashes was specified in the sentence and delivered by a designated official. Delaware courts used this punishment for a range of offenses through the first half of the 20th century, and the list of those offenses included wife beating, which created the historically interesting situation of the state punishing domestic violence by applying to the convicted husband the identical physical experience he had inflicted on his wife, apparently operating on some theory of experiential empathy through direct application of consequences that the court did not spell out in its rulings. The logic, if you follow it all the way to the end, has a certain rough geometric symmetry and nothing else to recommend it. Delaware formally abolished the whipping post in 1952. 1952, the same year that a young Elizabeth II was being crowned Queen of England, and America was testing hydrogen bombs in the Pacific, and I Love Lucy was the most watched program on American television. In that year, Delaware stopped using a whipping post as a public punishment. This fact is worth the few seconds it takes to properly absorb. Inside federal and state prisons, the use of corporal punishment through the strap or paddle was widespread through most of the first half of the century. The Federal Bureau of Prisons formally prohibited it in 1928. States followed their own timelines, which ranged from early to very late, and the gap between formal prohibition and actual practice was wide enough in some institutions that the prohibition was doing more symbolic than practical work. The standard procedure in institutions that maintain formal protocols involved a guard reporting an infraction to a supervising officer. A brief hearing confirmed that the infraction occurred, and then the administration of the punishment in a designated location. A medical officer might be required to certify that the prisoner was physically capable of receiving the punishment. A witness might be required to observe and verify the number of strokes. Maximum stroke counts might be specified. The documentation would be made. This procedure, with its paperwork and its medical officer and its specified maximums, was designed to make the practice look controlled, proportionate, and institutional rather than arbitrary and cruel. The paperwork was real. The controls were real, to the extent they were enforced. Whether the punishment itself, a man strapped down and struck across the back with a leather implement for having violated a rule about talking the corridor or having insufficient produce assigned to his work quota, whether that experience changed in its essential character because of the paperwork surrounding it is a question the paperwork could not answer. The records that survive from prison disciplinary files of the 1920s and 30s document the practice with matter-of-fact quality that is itself revealing. The infraction is noted. The punishment is noted. The officer who administered it is noted. The date is noted. The files were organized the way inventory was organized. This was routine record keeping, neither celebratory nor apologetic. Simply the administrative documentation of a thing that was understood to be a normal part of how the institution functioned. In some institutions, particularly in the South, the strap was used with a frequency that suggests it served less as a last resort for serious violations and more as a general management tool. Documents that have emerged from investigations of various southern prisons in the 1930s and 40s show disciplinary logs with entries for corporal punishment running into the dozens per month. A visitor reading those logs who was not already comfortable with the practice might have found the frequency alarming. The decline of formal institutionally sanctioned corporal punishment in American prisons was driven by several forces that converged through the middle decades of the century. Legal challenges began to accumulate as civil rights consciousness expanded, and as the legal system began to develop frameworks for evaluating prison conditions under the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Investigative journalism brought conditions inside specific institutions to public attention in ways that created political pressure for change. Professional organizations of prison administrators began to adopt standards that moved away from physical punishment toward other disciplinary mechanisms. And the courts began, haltingly and unevenly, to assert that what happened inside prison walls was not entirely beyond constitutional scrutiny. But formal prohibition, as we noted, is not the same as practical elimination. The strap became unauthorized. Guards who used physical force on prisoners were no longer doing it with administrative approval and documented procedure. They were doing it in ways that did not appear in the logs, which created its own kind of problem. Because unauthorized violence is harder to regulate than authorized violence, harder to document, harder to challenge legally, and harder to stop. The darkness does not disappear when you stop writing it in the ledger. It just stops being written down. Now, the strap was one thing. But the thing that waited at the end of the most serious journey through the American justice system was something else entirely. Something that was introduced with great fanfare and genuine optimistic faith in human progress, and that nevertheless produced results that a reasonable person examining them might describe using different words than progress. We need to talk about Thomas Edison, of all people, and about what happens when a commercial rivalry gets involved in how a country kills people. 1889 is where this story begins, which means we need to briefly step back before moving forward. A dentist in Buffalo, New York, named Alfred Southwick, has recently observed an accidental death. A man touched the terminals of an electrical dynamo and died. The dying took seconds. Southwick, who in his professional capacity had spent years observing tooth extractions done without adequate anesthesia, and who in his peripheral capacity, as a civic-minded person, had witnessed public hangings that went badly wrong, found himself thinking about the comparison. Hangings went wrong with some regularity. A rope that was too long produced decapitation, which was considered bad for everyone present in different ways. A rope that was too short, or a knot that was improperly tied, or a drop that was calculated incorrectly, produced a hanging that was not the swift death by broken neck it was supposed to be, but instead a slow death by strangulation that could take many minutes. The spectators at public hangings in the 19th century had watched this outcome often enough that it had produced genuine public discomfort, which was eventually one of the forces that pushed American execution practice from the public sphere to the institutional one. So Southwick's idea was not unreasonable on its face. Electricity produced a faster death than a poorly managed hanging. A faster death was presumably more humane. Perhaps electricity was the answer. Southwick wrote letters and lobbied, and eventually made contact with the Electrical Commission of the state of New York, which was examining alternatives to hanging. The commission consulted, among others, the most famous electrical engineer in the world, a man named Thomas Edison. And here is where the story becomes historically specific in a way that is worth dwelling on. Edison was, in principle, opposed to capital punishment. He had said so publicly. But Edison was also engaged in an extremely aggressive commercial battle with a man named George Westinghouse over which type of electrical current would power the coming electrical century. Edison used direct current. Westinghouse used alternating current. Edison believed, or claimed to believe, that alternating current was inherently more dangerous than direct current. Edison agreed to assist with the development of the electric chair, with a specific condition that it should use alternating current rather than direct current. His reasoning, stated openly enough that it remains in the historical record, was that if the electric chair used alternating current, it would associate Westinghouse's system with death in the public mind and give direct current a commercial advantage. This is either the most creative approach to product marketing in American business history, or an indicator that the commercial rivalry between Edison and Westinghouse had reached a level of intensity that affected the principal's judgment in unusual ways. Possibly both things simultaneously. History frequently offers us more than one valid interpretation. The electric chair was ready for use at Auburn prison in New York in 1890. The first prisoner executed in it was a man named William Kemmler, convicted of killing his partner with a hatchet. The execution took place on August 6, 1890. It was observed by physicians, prison officials, and several journalists who had been admitted as witnesses. It did not go as planned. The first application of current was insufficient to cause death. When the current was stopped and the circuit opened, Kemmler was still alive and was observed to be breathing. A second application of current was applied and maintained for a significantly longer period. Some of the witnesses later described smells of burning flesh and sounds consistent with physical distress. The official record of the time put the total duration of the execution at approximately 8 minutes from initial contact to confirmed death. One journalist present reportedly wrote that what he had seen was far worse than a hanging. Westinghouse, hearing the account, said in public that the result might have been achieved more efficiently with an axe, which was both true and a considerable response for a man who had just had his electrical system used in an execution specifically designed to make it look dangerous. Despite this beginning, the electric chair spread. By the 1920s, a majority of American states had adopted electrocution as their primary execution method. The chair became associated with modernity, with science, with the idea that civilization had found a better solution to an ancient problem. The cultural meaning of the chair expanded beyond its function. It became shorthand, appearing in crime fiction and newspaper reporting, and eventually in films as the symbol of capital punishment in America. The procedure for an execution by electric chair in the mid-20th century followed a pattern that was standardized enough to describe in general terms. The condemned prisoner was housed on death row, which was typically a separate section of the prison, often a separate building, where prisoners awaiting execution were kept in cells that differed from general population cells primarily in the specific quality of their anticipation. Death row in the 1930s or 40s was not designed to be actively cruel in its conditions. It was simply the place where a person who knew the date and approximate time of their death lived while that date approached. The execution itself happened in the early morning, usually between midnight and 6 in the morning. The timing was partly practical and partly atmospheric. Early morning was when the institution was at its quietest, the fewest staff and the fewest witnesses. There's also something about the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning that belong to a different category of experience than regular nighttime. They are the hours that feel farthest from the ordinary rhythms of the world. The prisoner was prepared. The head was shaved at the crown, a circular patch through which the electrode could make direct contact with the skull. The calf of one leg was also shaved. The shaving was a preparation for the mechanics of electrical contact. The chair itself was made of oak in most institutions, with leather straps at the wrists, ankles, and across the chest. A metal helmet fitted over the shaved crown of the head, with a wet sponge between the metal and the skin to ensure good electrical contact. A second electrode attached to the leg. The straps were tightened. The switch was thrown. The current used was typically between 1700 and 2500 volts in an initial surge, designed to cause immediate unconsciousness by disrupting brain function, followed by lower voltage maintained for a period intended to stop the heart. The physical response of the human body to this current was violent. The muscles contracted powerfully and completely against the restraints, the body arching against the straps with a force that the leather was designed to absorb. Under the procedure as intended, the prisoner lost consciousness essentially instantly and was dead within a few minutes. Under the procedure as not always intended, things did not go as cleanly. Electrical equipment required maintenance and calibration. Procedures required precise execution. Human error occurred. Witnesses at various documented executions across the decades reported executions that took longer than they should have, that required multiple applications of current, that produced physical evidence inconsistent with rapid and painless death. The gap between what the electric chair was supposed to do and what it sometimes did was not as wide as the gap between what a poorly managed hanging did and what it was supposed to do, but it was not as narrow as advocates of the technology suggested. Legal challenges to the electric chair began almost from its introduction. A constitutional challenge on behalf of Kemmler himself reached the Supreme Court in 1890. The court ruled that the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment applied to the historical practices of torture and burning at the stake, which the electric chair clearly did not resemble, and therefore the amendment was not violated. The ruling was issued before the execution had been carried out, and therefore before any of the evidence about how the procedure actually worked was available. The court was, in effect, ruling on a theory. The electric chair remained the primary American execution method for most of the 20th century. In 1968, the first moratorium on executions began as states responded to prospect of Supreme Court review. The Furman v. Georgia ruling in 1972 effectively halted executions across the country, and the Gregg v. Georgia ruling in 1976 allowed them to resume, but with new procedure requirements. By the time executions resumed in 1977, most states that retained the death penalty were beginning to move toward lethal injection, and the electric chair began its slow retirement from primary to backup, from backup to optional, from optional to vestigial. The last state to use the electric chair as its primary method was not a state you might guess. Nebraska used it as late as 1999. Virginia used it for a significant portion of its modern executions. South Carolina permitted condemned prisoners to choose between the chair and lethal injection through the first decade of the 21st century. The chair is still in some warehouses, some death chambers, some rooms that smell like a specific combination of cleaning products and something older underneath. The chair sits in those rooms in the way that old furniture sits in houses after the people who chose it are gone, present for reasons that are now more historical than practical. But the chair was not the beginning of execution in America. Before the chair arrived, and after it in various jurisdictions, there was something older, something that had been part of human punishment for so long that it had almost ceased to feel strange. There's a rope somewhere in this story. It has been there from the beginning. There's a thing about a hanging that the history books are somewhat careful around. The careful language tends to present it as a method, a procedure, a mechanism of law. The careful language discusses a long drop, the proper calculation of the fall distance based on the prisoner's weight, the placement of the knot, and all of that is accurate. But underneath the careful language is the simple fact that hanging, as a punishment, involves putting a rope around a person's neck and letting gravity do a specific kind of work. Americans have been doing this since the colonial era, which means that when the 20th century began, hanging had been part of American punishment for roughly 250 years. It was old the way certain institutions are old. Not because anyone specifically decided to keep it, but because no compelling enough reason to change it had yet prevailed at the relevant legislative level. The science of hanging had been formalized in the late 19th century by British executioners who developed what they called a long drop method, specifically intended to produce the rapid death by cervical fracture that a clean hanging provides rather than the slow death by strangulation that a short drop produces. The physics involved calculating the appropriate distance of the fall based on the prisoner's weight, with the goal of generating enough force at the end of the drop to snap the cervical vertebrae, usually at the second or third, severing or severely compressing the spinal cord and causing immediate unconsciousness. Tables existed, published tables correlating weight in pounds to drop distance in feet. British executioners became known internationally for their precision with these tables, for the kind of grim professional expertise that developed when you did the same thing repeatedly with the goal of doing it as well as it could be done. American practice was more variable. Executions were conducted at the county or state level, and the person responsible for carrying out an execution might do so rarely, which meant that the opportunity to develop consistent expertise was limited. County sheriffs in some rural jurisdictions were responsible for carrying out hangings and might conduct only one or two in an entire career. The result was a higher incidence of things not going quite right. A legal hanging in the American context in the early 20th century involved a gallows structure, either permanent or built for the occasion, with a trapdoor platform and a crossbeam and a carefully prepared rope. The rope was supposed to be of a specific thickness and of a material that did not stretch excessively, because stretching changed the effective drop distance and introduced unpredictability. The knot was important. The large loop with its distinctive positioning at the left side of the jaw was designed to produce a lateral and rotational force that snapped the neck in the intended way. Positioning of the knot was one of the areas where less experienced executioners were most likely to make consequential errors. Delaware hung people until 1958. Montana and Washington both used hanging into the 1960s. Washington state kept the gallows as a legally available option even later than that, though it used lethal injection for executions from 1994 onward. The last execution by hanging in the United States under state law took place in Delaware in 1996. The period between Kemmler's electric chair execution in 1890 and roughly the 1930s was a time when states were making individual decisions about which method they preferred, and hanging and electrocution coexisted as legal options in various jurisdictions. Some states use both, depending on the specific crime or the date of the offense. The resulting patchwork was neither systematic nor philosophically coherent, which was a fairly accurate description of American capital punishment policy generally during this period. Hanging occupied a specific place in the American cultural imagination that the electric chair did not. Hanging was associated with the frontier, with the summary justice of a less institutionalized era, with the image of the gallows tree, the rope, the crowd in a dusty western town. This association was partly mythological and partly accurate. Frontier executions did happen. Lynchings happened. The language of the gallows pervaded the American vernacular in ways that electrocution language never quite matched. What the chair was in cities, the rope was in the imagination of the West. Both were instruments of death. Both were backed by legal authority. Both were presented as rational and proportionate responses to specific crimes. Both produced results that a dispassionate observer might find difficult to distinguish from torture in cases where things went wrong. But hanging occupied a particular darkness in the history of American punishment, because hanging was not only what happened in courtrooms and prison yards, with the legal apparatus of sentences and death warrants and official witnesses. Hanging was also what happened outside those spaces, without any of that apparatus, for most of the first half of the 20th century. We need to spend some time with that darkness. It would be dishonest to move past it. This is not a comfortable part of the story. It is not comfortable because it involves things that were done deliberately, repeatedly, and in front of witnesses, sometimes in front of very large numbers of witnesses, and because the scale of it was not something that happened at the margins of American life in the early 20th century. It happened in communities, in town squares, in fields off public roads. It happened in places that the people doing it thought of as their homes. The Equal Justice Initiative, an Alabama-based civil rights organization, spent years documenting what happened between 1877 and 1950, examining thousands of individual cases from newspaper accounts, court records, personal testimony, and official documents. What they found was the following. In 12 southern states during that period, approximately 4,084 black Americans were killed by racial terror lynching. That number is almost certainly an undercount, because many incidents were never recorded in sources that would survive. Lynching in this context does not mean only death by hanging. It means mob violence resulting in death, and the methods included burning, shooting, drowning, and forms of torture preceding death that I will not describe in detail here, because detailed description would cross the line from historical documentation into something else. The point is that the killing was not always swift and was not always intended to be. The visibility of these acts was part of their function. Photographs were taken. Postcards were made from photographs and sold. Some victims' deaths were advertised in advance in newspapers. Crowds of hundreds and sometimes thousands attended. Children were brought. This is documented. The photographs survive. American newspapers of the early 20th century covered these events, some with outrage, some with the neutrality that newspapers applied to events they considered routine local news. The relationship between these acts and the official justice system was not one of opposition. In many documented cases, law enforcement was present. In some, law enforcement participated. In others, prisoners were removed from jails by mobs before their trials could occur, and local officials chose not to intervene. They chose. The choice was made deliberately. Federal anti-lynching legislation was introduced in Congress beginning in 1918. The Dyer Bill, which would have made lynching a federal crime, passed the House of Representatives in 1922 by a significant margin. It was killed in the Senate by a filibuster. It was introduced again in the 1930s. Killed again. The Senate did not formally apologize for its repeated failures to pass anti-lynching legislation until 2022, 104 years after the first attempt. The NAACP made anti-lynching advocacy a central part of its work from its founding in 1909. Ida B. Wells, a journalist and activist who had been documenting and analyzing lynching since the 1890s, produced investigative reports that were detailed enough to systematically challenge the justifications offered for practice, and were courageous enough to publish under circumstances that required personal bravery. She is one of the most significant historical figures in American journalism and one of the most under-discussed. Lynching declined over the decades as a result of multiple overlapping forces. The Great Migration moved enormous numbers of black Americans from the southern states to northern cities, which changed the geography of vulnerability. The civil rights movement brought sustained national and international attention to conditions in the South. Federal intervention in specific high-profile cases created legal precedents. The public discourse around explicit racial violence shifted enough that the kind of open celebration that had marked some early 20th century incidents became less socially sanctioned, even when the underlying attitudes that produced it remained. The last documented lynching by the historical definition occurred in 1981 in Mobile, Alabama. We will not remain here longer than the honesty of the story requires. But a history of brutal punishment in 20th century America that did not include this will be telling you a smaller story than the one that actually happened. Take a moment. Breathe. The history is heavy in this part. Now we're to go somewhere that might seem, on the surface, like a departure. But it is not a departure. It is the same story wearing different clothes. We are going to a place for children. You are 12 years old. The hallway you are standing in is painted in institutional white that is yellowed slightly around the windows and darkened slightly around the baseboards. The floor is linoleum, highly polished in a way that institutions polish floors, with a consistency and a dedication that civilian life rarely applies to the same task. The smell is floor polish and boiled food, and something underneath both of those that is harder to name, but that you will eventually recognize as the smell of large numbers of people who have limited control over their circumstances. The year is 1927. You have arrived at a reform school in Ohio, or Indiana, or Georgia, or wherever a particular court in your particular story decided to send you. The specific state matters less than the general institution, Because American reform schools of the 1920s occupied a philosophical space that was more consistent across state lines than many other features of the justice system. The reform school was one of the genuinely hopeful ideas in the history of American criminal justice. The original premise, developed through the mid-19th century and institutionalized in the first state reform schools beginning in the 1840s and 1850s, was this: children are not small adults. A child who has committed a crime, or who is at risk of doing so, is not the same as an adult criminal. The child's character is not yet formed. The child's circumstances can be changed. If you remove the child from the environment that was corrupting them and replace it with a structured, educational, industrious environment, you might produce a different outcome than if you simply sent them to adult prison. This was a genuinely good idea. It reflected a meaningful advance in thinking about youth, about moral development, about the appropriate response of society to children in trouble. The New York House of Refuge, founded in 1825, is generally considered the prototype. By the early 20th century, most states had at least one reform school, and the institution had expanded considerably. What happened between the good idea and the actual institution is a story that requires attention. The daily routine of the typical reform school in the 1920s and 30s had much more in common with a prison than with any educational institution. The day began early, typically 5:30 or 6 in the morning. Beds were made. The children, boys and girls in separate institutions, assembled in military formation in the yard or the central hall, counted, inspected. They ate breakfast in silence, following a tradition imported directly from the Auburn prison system that had decided silence was rehabilitative. Then they went to work. Reform schools of this era maintained productive enterprises: farms, laundries, canneries, printing operations, workshops producing various goods. The labor served two purposes simultaneously. It was described as vocational training, giving children skills they could use upon release. It also made the institutions financially self-sufficient, or partially so, which mattered to state legislatures that funded them, and that generally preferred not to fund things more than they absolutely had to. The children worked substantial hours, not a few hours of supervised vocational instruction, depending on the institution. 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours of repetitive physical labor. The legal protection that applied to child labor in external employment was, through a complicated series of loopholes and institutional exceptions, substantially inapplicable to reform school labor. Children in reform schools were technically not employed. They were institutionalized. The laws against child labor generally did not reach them. Discipline in the reform schools ranged across a wide spectrum. Some institutions had administrators who genuinely attempted to implement the rehabilitative vision and who tried to manage discipline through graduated non-physical responses. A significant number of institutions used corporal punishment as a routine management tool. Children were struck across the buttocks or the hand with paddles, straps, or switches for infractions ranging from talking during meals to more serious violations. In some institutions, older residents, boys who had been there long enough to acquire seniority, were used to enforce discipline over younger arrivals, creating hierarchies of coercion that were difficult for administrators to claim they had not anticipated. Solitary confinement, called various things in various institutions, isolation room, the dark room, the box, was used even for very young children. A child as young as 8 or 10 years old, confined alone in a small room for days at a time for a serious violation of institutional rules, was not a scenario that struck the administrators of most 1920s reform schools as requiring particular justification. The practice was documented. It was not considered exceptional. The physical conditions of reform schools were shaped by the same political economy that shaped every other institution we have visited tonight. They were chronically underfunded because state legislators directed resources toward things their constituents thought about regularly, and the average voting citizen in 1927 did not spend a great deal of time thinking about the children in reform schools. Old buildings with poor heating, insufficient beds leading to doubled-up sleeping arrangements, food that was nutritionally adequate for work calorie purposes and monotonous enough to make the very smell of it eventually aversive. Abuse by staff existed in these institutions. It was documented in investigations that occurred when things became severe enough or public enough to force inquiry. Sexual abuse by staff of residents was found in multiple institutions across the century. Physical abuse exceeding any institutional disciplinary authorization was found. Deaths of residents that were formally attributed to illness or accident were, in some investigated cases, found to have more complicated explanations. This is not to say that everyone who worked in these institutions was abusive, or that every institution was at the worst end of the spectrum. Some were not. Some had dedicated staff who were limited by their era's understanding, but who were genuinely trying. Some children passed through reform schools and attributed no lasting harm to the experience. The spectrum was real, but the children who were most likely to be sent to reform schools were the children who were already most vulnerable, who had the least family support, the least social capital, the least ability to navigate the systems that were supposed to protect them. They were poor children. They were children of color who faced the same racial disparities in juvenile justice that adults faced in adult courts. They were children who had no one powerful enough to advocate for them, no one whose attention to their circumstances would have motivated better institutional conditions. The juvenile justice system underwent significant formal reform through the mid-20th century, culminating in the landmark Supreme Court decision in Reed-Galt in 1967, which established that children in juvenile proceedings had constitutional due process rights, including the right to counsel, the right to notice of charges, and the right to confront witnesses. Before that decision, a child could be committed to a reform school at a hearing where they had no lawyer, no right to present evidence, and no meaningful ability to challenge the court's determination of what was in their best interests. The reform schools changed their names, became training schools, youth development centers, juvenile correctional facilities. Some of their practices changed substantially. Others changed more slowly than the names did. The crow on the fence at the edge of the yard examines the institution with its characteristic sideways tilt of the head, assessing and then dismissing the scene with the pragmatism that crows have always applied to human arrangements. The fence is still there. The yard is still rectangular. The children inside are still trying to understand what they did to arrive here, and most of them are still not entirely sure. We are going to leave the reform school now and go somewhere that presents itself in a specific kind of language, the language of care, of treatment, of medicine, a place that was supposed to be something very different from a prison, and that, for many of the people inside it, was something very different from what it was supposed to be. The building sits on a hill outside of town, surrounded by grounds that are genuinely beautiful. It is 1935. The grounds include large trees, lawns, and a series of connected buildings in the Victorian Italianate style that characterized institutional architecture of the century before, buildings with wide porches and generous windows, and a pastoral setting that was deliberately chosen to communicate serenity, fresh air, and distance from the urban disorder that was considered pathogenic. This is a state mental hospital. The language has shifted. It used to be an asylum, which carried the original Latin meaning of a place of refuge, and that original meaning was sincere. The people who built the first American psychiatric institutions in the mid-19th century were motivated by genuine humanitarian concern. They believed that the mentally ill, who had previously been kept in jails, in poorhouses, in attics and cellars, and spare rooms by families too ashamed to seek help, deserved a dedicated institution where treatment could be provided. The beautiful grounds were not decoration. They were therapy. Light and air and pastoral calm were understood to be healing forces. And then the money ran out. Or rather, the money was never quite sufficient. And then the population grew and grew again, and the appropriations from state legislatures did not keep pace. And the institution that had been designed for 400 patients was housing 800, and then 1,200. And then the grounds were beautiful, but what happened inside the buildings was something the grounds could not fix. The state mental hospital intersects with a history of punishment in a specific and important way. Because the mental hospital in early 20th century America was not a place for people who were mentally ill in the ways that modern medicine would recognize and diagnose. The legal standard for commitment was, in most states and for most of the first half of the century, so broadly written and so loosely administered that it could be applied to almost anyone whose behavior the people around them found inconvenient. Women who refused to submit to their husbands could be committed by those husbands with a doctor's signature and no legal hearing. Gay men could be committed. People with epilepsy were routinely committed. Immigrants who spoke limited English and behaved in culturally unfamiliar ways could be committed on the recommendation of any physician. Elderly people whose families did not want the burden of their care could be committed. People who had committed crimes, but whose crimes were attributed by the court to mental illness rather than criminal intent, were committed. The poor and the friendless, who had no family to care for them and who fell into visible distress in public spaces, were committed. The process of commitment in most states required physician signature, sometimes two physician signatures. No formal hearing in many jurisdictions. No right to legal representation. No mechanism to challenge the commitment. Once committed, the patient had no clear legal path to demanding release, no appeal to outside authority, no right to refuse treatment. Inside a severely overcrowded state hospital, the experience was shaped by the institution's resources and the quality of its staff, which varied as widely as it did in prisons. At better-funded institutions with conscientious administrators, patients received what the medicine of the era understood to be treatment. Hydrotherapy, meaning baths at specific temperatures administered for specific conditions. Occupational therapy, organized work, and craft designed to provide stimulation and routine. For the wealthier patients in private facilities, early psychotherapy. At the majority of overcrowded, underfunded state hospitals, the picture was different. Patients were warehoused. Wards designed for 60 held 150. Staff ratios were insufficient by any reasonable standard. Nursing staff were poorly paid and inadequately trained managed through the economy of force, meaning through restraints and isolation and the threat of each. Mechanical restraints were standard. Straitjackets, leather straps, crib beds, enclosed bed structures that prevented patients from leaving without staff assistance. Isolation rooms, called seclusion rooms in the clinical language, where patients considered disruptive were confined alone. The conditions of personal hygiene in severely overcrowded institutions were a serious and persistent problem documented in every significant investigation of these places that occurred during the first half of the century. Albert Deutsch's 1948 book, The Shame of the States, which examined conditions in state mental hospitals across the country based on direct observation, described scenes that were striking enough to produce genuine public response. The photographs that accompanied the text, taken by journalist Albert Maisel and published in Life magazine in 1946, show conditions that Americans who had just spent several years hearing about the liberation of Nazi concentration camps found uncomfortably resonant. The comparison was not accidental. Some of the physicians who went to examine European concentration camps after the war and who subsequently also visited American state hospitals for the insane made the comparison in professional publications. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a brief in a relevant case that used the word concentration camp. The comparison was heated and contested, but the conditions that produced it were documented. Shock treatments arrived in the 1930s and were rapidly adopted in American institutions. Insulin coma therapy induced hypoglycemic comas through insulin injection, which was supposed to address some forms of psychosis. Metrazole therapy induced grand mal seizures through chemical injection. Both were administered without anesthesia. Both produced physical experiences that patients found deeply distressing, which was documented in patients' accounts where those accounts were preserved. Both were replaced eventually by less harrowing alternatives. Electroconvulsive therapy arrived in the United States around 1940 and is a surviving member of this family of treatments, significantly refined from its original form into something that modern medicine considers an effective treatment for certain conditions administered with anesthesia, muscle relaxants, and careful monitoring. The 1940s version was different. No anesthesia, no muscle relaxants, an uninhibited grand mal seizure in a patient who was fully conscious immediately before and regained full consciousness immediately after. The physical force of the seizure was sufficient, in some patients, to fracture vertebrae or dislocate joints. Whether administered to someone who genuinely benefited from the treatment or administered to someone who simply needed to be quieter and more manageable on the ward, the experience was the same experience. The beneficial outcome for some patients did not change the experience of the patients for whom the benefit did not materialize. And then there was the lobotomy. Walter Freeman was a neurologist who became the primary American advocate for psychosurgery and who developed a technique he called a transorbital lobotomy, also known as the ice pick technique, in which a surgical instrument was inserted to the upper eyelid into the brain's frontal lobe and manipulated to sever neural connections. Freeman was not a surgeon and could not perform his procedure in a standard surgical setting, which would have required a neurosurgeon. But he could perform it quickly with minimal equipment, which meant he could perform it in state hospitals, which was his goal. Freeman believed with genuine conviction that the procedure relieved suffering. Some of his patients did show reduction in agitated behavior. Others were left with cognitive impairments that their families could not distinguish in the mental illness the procedure was supposed to treat, only quieter. Some died from the procedure. Some were changed in ways that their families found impossible to describe as improvement, but also impossible to describe as the same illness, because the person who emerged was not the same person who had gone in. Approximately 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States between 1936 and 1960. Walter Freeman performed approximately 3,500 of them personally, traveling from state hospital to state hospital in a van he called the lobotomobile, which is a sentence that the historical record requires to be written even though writing it feels like an absurdist gesture. The mental asylum system reached its maximum size in the mid-1950s, housing approximately 560,000 people in state institutions across the country. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s, driven by the introduction of antipsychotic medications and by the reform-minded political environment that had been educated by investigative reporting and academic research, substantially reduced those numbers over the following decades. The buildings on the Hill are still there in many places. Some are abandoned. Some have been converted into apartments or colleges or office buildings. A few still operate as psychiatric facilities of a substantially different character. The wide porches are still graceful. The trees are still large. The grounds are still, in their way, beautiful. The space between the beauty and what happened inside is the space that this part of the story occupies. We're going to leave the asylum now and go back to the prisons, to a specific feature of prison life that has been present throughout this story and that we need to examine directly. Because there is something about deliberate isolation that is its own kind of punishment within a punishment, and the 20th century use it extensively. The cell is 6 feet by 9 feet. You can verify this yourself. Stand in the center of whatever room you are in right now, and try to imagine a space 6 feet wide by 9 feet long. That is smaller than most bathroom floors. It is smaller than most walk-in closets. It contains a bunk, a toilet, and a sink. There may be a small shelf. The door is solid metal with a slot at the bottom for the passage of meal trays, and a small covered port to which a guard can observe the interior without entering. The window, if there is one, faces either an exterior wall of the building through which you can see a narrow strip of sky that changes color with the weather and the time of day, or it faces the interior of the cell block, in which case it is illuminated by the same artificial light at all hours regardless of what the sun is doing in the world outside. You are in what the prison calls the segregation unit. Other names: solitary confinement, the hole, the box, the cooler, the dark. The names vary by institution and by era. The experience does not vary much. Solitary confinement has been part of American prison practice since before the 20th century began. The Pennsylvania system of the early 19th century, when the two dominant competing philosophies of early American imprisonment, was built around extended solitary confinement as its primary rehabilitative mechanism. The theory was that a man kept entirely alone, with no social contact, no outside stimulation, nothing but his own conscience and the Bible left in his cell, would be driven inward by the silence until he encountered his crimes and was reformed by that encounter. The Pennsylvania system lost the practical institutional competition to the Auburn system, but the use of solitary confinement as a disciplinary tool persisted everywhere, in every type of institution, across the whole century. The scientific understanding of what solitary confinement does to the human nervous system developed slowly and became robust primarily in the second half of the 20th century. We now know the following with considerable certainty, based on decades of psychological research. The human nervous system is designed for social interaction. It is calibrated to receive and process social information as a fundamental feature of its normal operation. When that social input is removed systematically, over extended periods, the system does not simply go dormant and wait. It begins to malfunction. Anxiety is typically among the first symptoms to appear. then hypersensitivity to sounds and light and touch, the nervous system turning up its gain in the absence of the social information it is designed to process. Perceptual distortions follow. In extended isolation, hallucinations occur in people who had no prior psychiatric history. Cognitive function degrades. Time perception distorts so severely that people in isolation frequently cannot accurately estimate how long they have been confined. Paranoid ideation develops or intensifies. Depression deepens. In some cases, psychotic symptoms emerge that persist long after the isolation ends. The people administering American prisons in the 1920s and 30s did not have this research, but they had the people. They could observe what happened when a man went into isolation and what emerged when he came out. The observation was possible. The conclusion that isolation was producing psychological injury was available to anyone paying attention. The observation did not, in most institutions, produce a policy change. There were practical reasons for using segregation as a disciplinary and management tool. Prisoners who had attacked other prisoners or staff presented a genuine safety problem. Prisoners who were involved in organizing resistance or planning escapes needed to be separated from the general population for reasons that were not unreasonable on their face. The question of how long the separation needed to last, under what conditions, with what provision for human contact and mental stimulation, was a question that most institutions were not asking carefully. The more uncomfortable reason for extended solitary confinement was simpler. Inmates who could not be managed through ordinary disciplinary tools were managed through isolation, regardless of whether the management goal justified the duration or the conditions. A prisoner who was argumentative, who organized other prisoners, who attracted outside attention, who was politically inconvenient, could be moved to segregation and kept there in ways that effectively remove him from the general institutional population indefinitely. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, which opened in 1934 on an island in San Francisco Bay, had an isolation unit in its D block where prisoners could be confined in individual cells that were further isolated from the rest of the unit. Prisoners held in D block at Alcatraz in the 1930s and 40s described experiences of what they called a hole: complete isolation, minimal light, no activity, meals pushed through a slot in the door. The duration of these confinements ranged from days to years in documented cases. The psychological deterioration documented in prisoners who spent extended periods in the Alcatraz isolation unit and in similar facilities at other maximum security prisons was eventually part of the evidence base that drove reform discussions. But the reforms were slow to arrive and incomplete when they did. Solitary confinement as a practice did not go away. It expanded. The 1980s and 1990s saw the development of supermax facilities specifically designed for long-term isolation, institutions where the entire design principle was the management of prisoners through the minimization of all human contact. By the early 21st century, approximately 80,000 people in the United States were being held in some form of solitary confinement at any given time. The debate about the practice that this fact should have generated, and that reformers and researchers and formerly incarcerated people were in fact generating, had begun to produce some policy changes. But the changes were fighting against both institutional inertia and a punitive cultural environment that found it difficult to extend concern for the psychological well-being of people who had committed serious crimes. The 6-foot by 9-foot room weights. The light through the narrow window has shifted. Morning has become afternoon, has become evening, has become the dark hours. In the dark hours, the sounds of the institution are reduced to their minimum. The quiet is not peaceful. It is the quiet of a place designed to be very quiet, which is a different thing. Rest in the dark for just a moment. We are going to step out of this cell and into a specific landscape that shaped the lives of generations of prisoners in ways that are as much about geography as about anything else. The Mississippi River makes a long, slow bend in West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. On the inside of that bend sits 18,000 acres of land that was once one of the largest cotton plantations in the antebellum South. 3 sides of the property are bounded by the river or by the Tunica Hills. The 4th side faces 18 miles of swamp. The isolation is total in the way that geographic features can make isolation total, not just the isolation of a wall but the isolation of water and distance and terrain that has no particular interest in making human passage convenient. The Louisiana State Penitentiary has occupied this land since 1868. It is called Angola, a name that refers to the plantation it replaced, which was named for the region of Western Africa that most of the enslaved people who built it have been taken from. The name is itself a compressed history. Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the United States by acreage and has been, through much of its history, one of the most feared. The combination of its geographic isolation, its scale, its agricultural model, and the specific way it was administered created conditions that federal court interventions, investigative journalism, and the account of former prisoners have documented in considerable detail. The mourning in Angola in the 1930s begins early. The barracks that house the prisoners are long wooden buildings, and in summer, the heat inside the by morning is already substantial. Louisiana heat is a regional phenomenon that people from other climates sometimes do not entirely believe until they have experienced it. It is not just hot, it is wet hot. The particular combination of temperature and humidity that makes your clothing feel like a warm wet cloth applied directly to your skin rather than a garment you are wearing. In the barracks before the sun is even fully risen, that combination is already present. The prisoners assembled in the yard. They were divided into working groups called gangs, with names that varied over the decades. The number 1 host squad, the tractor crew, the yard crew, the kitchen gang. The agricultural labor was the center of the institution's operation. Cotton was the primary crop for much of the early and mid-20th century, supplemented by corn, sweet potatoes, and other food crops. The prison fed itself largely from what it grew, and the surplus was sold. The working gangs moved to the fields under the supervision of armed guards who were called gunmen or gun riders. They rode horses, carrying rifles, supervising work from a physical elevation that communicated the relationship between the mounted guard and the man on foot with considerable clarity. Some of these guards were civilians hired for the purpose. Others were prisoners themselves, paroled or trustee prisoners who had been given responsibility for supervising their fellow prisoners, an arrangement called the trustee system that was common throughout southern prison farms, and that created a complex and sometimes brutal hierarchy within the prisoner population. The pace of work in the fields was determined by the gunmen. Men who did not work fast enough faced verbal pressure, then formal disciplinary action, then the strap. The strap at Angola was not a last resort. It was a standard management tool through the first several decades of the century, documented in logbooks that have been preserved and examined by scholars. The frequency with which it appeared in those logbooks suggests that it was used as a routine response to productivity shortfalls and rule violations rather than as a serious sanction reserved for the most severe infractions. Prisoners at Angola who faced the most serious disciplinary infractions encountered the dungeon. The dungeon was a set of isolation cells in the lower level of the main building, damp and dark, with conditions that investigations from the 1950s onward found deeply troubling. The term dungeon was not metaphorical. It referred to a physical space with physical characteristics that a medieval castle's residents would have recognized. Angola produced, alongside all of this, one of the most significant bodies of American music of the 20th century. Alan Lomax, the folklorist and musicologist who spent decades recording traditional American music for the Library of Congress and for his own documentation projects, visited Angola multiple times in the 1930s and 40s. He recorded the work Songs and Blues that prisoners sang in the fields and in the barracks, music that had developed in the specific conditions of plantation-descended forced labor over generations. What he captured was a genuine artistic tradition of extraordinary quality, music that expressed suffering and resilience, and something specifically human that the institution had not been able to eliminate. The blues that came from Angola and from similar institutions across the South became, through complex paths of migration and influence, a foundational element of American popular music. Its presence in rock and roll, in rhythm and blues, in jazz, and the music that defined the American sound of the 20th century is well documented by musicologists. The distance between where those sounds originated and the music that now fills stadiums and concert halls is a measure of something about American cultural history that resists easy interpretation. Angola began significant reform in the 1970s, following a series of federal court interventions that found conditions unconstitutional and mandated improvements. The reform process was long, uneven, and contested, as reform processes in large institutions always are. Angola at the end of the 20th century was a different institution from Angola in the 1930s in some significant ways, and similar in others that were more resistant to change. The river keeps bending. The current keeps moving. It has moved this way for a very long time. We have one more execution method to examine before we move into the final stretch of the century. It was introduced with the same hopeful rhetoric as the electric chair: science, modernity, humanity, and it encountered the same gap between intention and reality. In the spring of 1921, the Nevada state legislature met in session to consider the question of capital punishment. Nevada had the electric chair. It had experimented with hanging. There was a growing sentiment, particularly among legislators who were paying attention to how executions were being received by the public and by reform-minded journalists, that there must be something better, something that produced the rapid death that the electric chair promised, without the physical evidence of suffering that sometimes accompanied it. An Army Chemical Warfare Service officer named Major D. A. Turner was consulted. He suggested that lethal gas might be the answer. The chemical in question was hydrogen cyanide, which had been used in warfare during the recently concluded World War I, and which had been observed by those who had the misfortune of observing it, to produce rapid unconsciousness and death when inhaled in sufficient concentration. Nevada passed the Humane Execution Act in 1921. 3 years later, in 1924, the first execution by lethal gas in American history was carried out in Nevada. The prisoner was a Chinese immigrant named Ji John, convicted of murder. The gas chamber had entered the American justice system. The apparatus of a gas chamber is straightforward in concept. The condemned prisoner is seated in a sealed, airtight chamber, roughly the size of a large closet or a very small room, equipped with observation windows through which witnesses can watch the execution. The prisoner is strapped to a chair inside the chamber. Below the chair is a pan containing sulfuric acid. At the appropriate moment, cyanide pellets are mechanically released into the acid, which generates hydrogen cyanide gas that rises from below. Hydrogen cyanide, when inhaled, enters the bloodstream through the lungs and interferes at the cellular level with the body's ability to process oxygen. The mechanism is called histotoxic hypoxia. The cells cannot use the oxygen they receive, and the organs that are most dependent on immediate oxygen supply, primarily the brain and the heart, fail rapidly. The theory was that unconsciousness would occur within approximately 10 seconds of the gas reaching full concentration, followed by death within a few minutes. The witnesses who observed gas chamber executions over the subsequent decades across the various states that adopted the method described in documented accounts a picture that was somewhat different from this clinical description. Prisoners appeared to move after the gas was introduced. They coughed. Their heads moved. Their bodies showed signs of effort. Witnesses described executions in which these signs of activity continued for periods longer than the stated 10-second loss of consciousness timeline would suggest. Whether this represented actual consciousness or post-conscious physiological responses was debated, but the debate itself was indicative of the ambiguity that made witnesses uncomfortable. The gas chamber spread through the 1930s and 40s. California adopted it and built the famous green-painted chamber at San Quentin Prison that became one of the most documented execution chambers in the country. Nevada, California, Arizona, Colorado, Missouri, Wyoming, North Carolina, Maryland, Mississippi, Oregon, and New Mexico all used gas chambers at various points in the 20th century. The witness experience of a gas chamber execution had a specific quality that distinguished it from other methods. The chamber was visible through the observation window, but sealed. You could see everything that happened inside and could hear nothing. Whatever sounds a prisoner made, whatever sounds the process produced, reached the witness gallery only as visual information. This complete severing of sound from sight gave the whole proceeding a dreamlike, aquarium quality that witnesses found unsettling in ways that were harder to articulate than the straightforward physical distress of a badly managed hanging. The association between the gas chamber and the gas chambers of the Nazi extermination camps, which became known to the American public in detail during and after World War II, affected how the method was perceived, even though the mechanisms were different and the institutional contexts were entirely different. The visual and conceptual resemblance was uncomfortable enough that several states that had adopted the gas chamber moved away from it after the war. Arizona used a gas chamber execution as late as 1999. A man named Walter Legrand, a German national, was executed in the Arizona gas chamber in February of that year. Witnesses described an execution that lasted approximately 10 minutes from the introduction of the gas to confirm death, with visible signs of distress during portions of that period. The account contributed to renewed legal and public debate about whether the gas chamber constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The gas chamber has been replaced in most states by lethal injection, but it remains a legally available option in several states that have maintained it. The sealed rooms sit empty in most places. The chair bolted to the floor. The observation windows. The mechanism below the chair that waited for the pellets. Each of these objects in an empty chamber is a kind of document, a record of a decision that a society made about how it would do a thing that it had decided it needed to do. Breathe. The air around you is ordinary air. The room you are in is an ordinary room. We are getting close to the final chapters of this story, and I want to spend the last chapters looking at something different. Not a specific method of punishment, but the scale of the thing, the sheer numerical reality of what the second half of the 20th century built. In 1970, approximately 200,000 Americans were incarcerated in state and federal prisons. That number is not small. It is 200,000 people, which is larger than the population of most American cities. But it is a number that existed within a range that had been relatively stable for decades, that was comparable to incarceration rates in other democratic nations. And that did not represent a structural feature of American society, so much as it represented the ongoing operations of a criminal justice system of a certain scale. By 2008, that number had become 2.3 million. 2.3 million people in American prisons and jails, not counting people on probation or parole, of whom there were millions more, a 500% increase over approximately 35 years, in a country whose total population had grown by less than 50% over the same period. The United States, which represented approximately 5% of the global population, was at this time holding approximately 25% of the world's prison population. This is what scholars call mass incarceration. It is a defining feature of American criminal justice in the final decades of the 20th century, and it is in many ways its own form of collective punishment, applied not just to people incarcerated, but to the communities they came from and the families they left behind. Understanding how this happened requires looking at a set of policy decisions that accumulated over roughly 3 decades, each one individually defensible by its advocates, and collectively producing a result that most of those advocates had not explicitly intended, and that few of them publicly endorsed as an end goal. The war on drugs, formally announced by President Nixon in 1971, substantially escalated by President Reagan through the 1980s, and maintained as a central feature of federal law enforcement policy for decades afterward, was the single most significant driver of incarceration growth. Drug offenses accounted for roughly half of the growth in federal prison population and a significant portion of state prison growth. The crack cocaine sentencing guidelines established by federal law in 1986 created a 100-to-1 disparity between the sentencing for crack cocaine, which was more prevalent in black urban communities, and powder cocaine, which was more prevalent in white and wealthy communities, for equivalent amounts of the drug. The disparity was not accidental in its effects, even if the intention behind it was contested. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws, adopted by the federal government in most states during this period, removed judicial discretion from sentencing in specified cases and required that certain crimes result in certain minimum prison terms regardless of individual circumstances. 3 strikes laws in California and other states mandated extremely long sentences for anyone convicted of third felony, including, in some cases, felonies that were nonviolent. The abolition of federal parole in 1987 meant that people sentenced to federal prison served their full terms. The elimination of Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated people in 1994 effectively ended college education in prisons. Each of these policy changes had advocates who believed they were making the criminal justice system more consistent, more just, and more effective at deterring crime. The evidence for deterrent effectiveness, when it was examined carefully, was not strong. The growth in incarceration did not produce a corresponding growth in public safety that could be cleanly attributed to incapacitation. Crime rates fluctuated for reasons that were complex and that criminologists continue to debate, and the growth in the prison population tracked those fluctuations poorly. What the growth in incarceration did produce, clearly and measurably, was overcrowding. When you incarcerate people at 5 times the historical rate, without building prison capacity at a corresponding rate, the math resolves itself in the bodies of the people inside. California's prisons by the early 2000s were housing approximately twice the number of people they were designed to hold. The Coleman versus Plata case, decided by the Supreme Court in 2011, found that California's prison overcrowding was so severe and the resulting inadequacy of medical and mental health care so extreme that it constituted a violation of the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The court noted that prisoners were dying from treatable medical conditions at an estimated rate of 1 per week, attributable to the inadequacy of care in an overwhelmingly overcrowded system. This was California, not Alabama in 1912, not Georgia in 1930. California in 2011. Overcrowding produced violence. When an institution designed for a certain number of people holds twice that number, the informal systems that manage tension in any confined population break down. The ability of staff to monitor and intervene in conflicts is reduced. The gang structures that had developed in California prisons since the 1960s became dominant organizing structures in the absence of adequate institutional alternatives. The racial divisions that those structures maintained were enforced through violence that the institution's overwhelmed staff could not consistently prevent. The racial composition of the growing prison population reflected and amplified the disparities that had been present in the criminal justice system since its beginning. The policies that drove mass incarceration did not descend from nowhere. They were applied by enforcement agencies that already had well-documented patterns of racially disparate policing. They were administered by prosecutorial offices that already had well-documented patterns of racially disparate charging decisions. They were processed by courts that already had well-documented patterns of racially disparate sentencing. The compression of all of these disparities through a system that was operating at 5 times its historical scale produced statistical outcomes that were impossible to describe as coincidental. By the early 21st century, approximately 1 in 3 black men born in the United States in the previous generation could expect to be incarcerated at some point in their lifetime. For white men, the comparable figure was approximately 1 in 17. The social cost of mass incarceration extended far beyond the prison walls. Children grew up without parents who were incarcerated. Neighborhoods with high incarceration rates lost significant portions of their working-age male population during their most economically productive years, reducing income, reducing tax base, reducing the social capital that communities depend on for stability. The disenfranchisement of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people in most states affected the political representation of the communities most affected by incarceration. The employment discrimination that formerly incarcerated people faced upon release created cycles of poverty and recidivism that the justice system itself was structurally ill-equipped to address. The scale of it, that is what mass incarceration added to the American experience of punishment that earlier eras, with all their specific brutalities, had not contained. The scale turned individual suffering into structural condition. It turned the justice system into a form of social organization. It made the prison not a place that most Americans had any personal connection to, but a place that an enormous number of Americans had direct, personal, embodied knowledge of as former prisoners, as family members of prisoners, as residents of communities shaped by incarceration's presence. The wind outside the prison is the same wind it has always been. The seasons change at the same speed regardless of what the legislature has decided. Inside, the calendar matters and does not matter simultaneously. The history of brutal punishment in 20th century America is not only a history of brutality. It is important to say this clearly, because a story told only as suffering risks missing the humans who were always, throughout all of it, refusing to accept the story as finished. Reformers existed from the beginning. They existed before the century began, and they continued throughout it. And their work was neither futile nor complete, but was real and consequential and ongoing. The reformers came from every direction. Some were lawyers who believed that the legal system could be turned toward the protection of the people it was most effectively ignoring. Some were journalists whose investigative instincts led them into places the institutions would have preferred they not go. Some were physicians and psychologists whose professional training made the conditions they encountered in prisons and hospitals a medical as well as a moral problem. Some were religious figures for whom the treatment of the imprisoned was not a political question, but a theological one. Some were formerly incarcerated people who carried the knowledge of their own experience and refused to let it stay private. The Wickersham Commission, appointed by President Herbert Hoover in 1929 and reporting in 1931, produced a 14-volume examination of American law enforcement that included a detailed and damning account of the use of physical coercion by police to extract confessions, the practice known as a third degree. The commission found it widespread, systematic, and largely unprosecuted. The findings were widely discussed and contributed to the long process of legal reform that eventually produced Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 and the expanded rights of accused persons during interrogation. The ACLU, founded in 1920, brought legal challenges to prison conditions from the beginning. Organizations that came later, including the Southern Poverty Law Center founded in 1971, focused specifically on the conditions in Southern prisons and jails that have been chronically inadequate in documented ways. Legal services organizations providing representation to incarcerated people developed through the 1960s and 70s, creating a capacity for legal challenge that had not previously existed. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s changed the political and legal environment in ways that were not exclusively about voting rights and public accommodations. They created an expanded conception of constitutional rights as applicable to all Americans regardless of their status, a conception that reached into prison walls in ways it had not previously. The Eighth Amendment jurisprudence of the Supreme Court from the 1970s onward developed a doctrine of evolving standards of decency, which meant that what counted as cruel and unusual punishment was not fixed in the meaning of the phrase at the time it was adopted, but developed with the moral understanding of the society. Key cases. Estelle versus Gamble in 1976 established that deliberate indifference to a prisoner's serious medical needs was an Eighth Amendment violation. Ruiz versus Estelle in 1980, a landmark Texas case, found that the conditions of the Texas prison system violated the Eighth Amendment across multiple dimensions: overcrowding, security, medical care, access to courts. The judgment required sweeping reforms over a period of decades. The Attica Prison Rebellion of September 1971 was one of the defining events of American prison history. Prisoners at Attica Correctional Facility in New York took over the institution to demand better conditions and took hostages. After 4 days of negotiations, Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered state police to retake the prison by force. 33 prisoners and 10 hostages died in the retaking, with the hostages dying from the police gunfire that was supposed to rescue them. The full history of Attica took decades to document, as the state's initial account of events were contradicted by subsequent investigation. But the uprising and its violent ending focused national attention on prison conditions in a way that nothing had before. The evidence of wrongful convictions that DNA testing made possible beginning in the 1990s was perhaps the most intellectually powerful challenge to capital punishment specifically. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 by lawyers Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, worked to exonerate people who had been wrongly convicted using DNA evidence. By the early 21st century, they had exonerated over 200 people, including more than a dozen who had been on death row. Each exoneration was a documented case in which the American criminal justice system had made an error serious enough to send an innocent person to death row. The implications for capital punishment were direct and unavoidable. If the system makes errors serious enough to convict innocent people of capital crimes, then a system that executes people will, over time, execute innocent people. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a mathematical certainty given any non-zero error rate and any continuation of executions. The research on wrongful convictions was not primarily an emotional argument, though it had emotional force. It was a systemic argument. The system is not reliable enough to justify irreversible consequences. The reformers won specific victories throughout the century. The formal end to convict leasing, the abolition of the public whipping post, the development of constitutional protections for prisoners. The Supreme Court's prohibition on executing juvenile offenders in Roper v. Simmons in 2005. The prohibition on executing intellectually disabled persons in Atkins v. Virginia in 2002. The steady expansion of professional standards in corrections that moved away from the worst practices. And they did not win everything. Mass incarceration grew throughout the period when many of these legal victories were being won. The death penalty continued to be applied. Racial disparities in the system persisted. Solitary confinement expanded. The work was and remains incomplete. A small amount of light in a very dark room does not eliminate the darkness, but it changes what the darkness means and what you can see within it. The reformers kept working. They are still working. We have arrived at the end of the century. The year is 1999. America is preparing for whatever the year 2000 might bring, which turned out to be somewhat less dramatic than the cultural anxiety of the moment suggested. But standing in 1999 and looking back across the 100 years just elapsed, what do you see? You see a country that argued with itself throughout the century about what punishment was supposed to accomplish and how it was supposed to be done. The argument was not always honest, and the participants were not always acting in good faith. And the outcomes of the argument were not always proportionate to the suffering that was generating it. But the argument was real and continuous, and it changed things. The formal abolition of convict leasing, the disappearance of the chain gang from American roads in its classical iron-linked form, the end of public whipping as a legal sentence, the formal prohibition of corporal punishment in most institutional settings, the development of constitutional protections for prisoners that courts would actually enforce, the elimination of the execution of children, the elimination of the execution of the intellectually disabled, the movement away from the electric chair and the gas chamber toward lethal injection, driven partly by the same logic of seeking something that looked more like medicine than like punishment. Each of these was a victory for the people who worked for it. Each of them came too slowly for the people who suffered while the work was being done. Both things are true simultaneously. What the century left behind was also real. 2.3 million people in prison. Racial disparities that were, by the statistics, more extreme at the century's end in certain dimensions than they had been at the century's beginning, even though the explicit racial mechanisms of the convict leasing era had been dismantled. A death penalty that continued to be applied in a significant number of states with an error rate that had been demonstrated to be high enough to convict innocent people. Solitary confinement expanding into supermax facilities that applied the Pennsylvania system's total isolation at a scale and for durations that the founders of that system had not contemplated. Mental health care so inadequate in prisons and jails that by the end of the century, the largest mental health providers in many American cities were county jails. The 20th century in America was 100 years of a country arguing with itself and getting some things right and many things wrong and continuing to argue. It is the story of a powerful nation's ongoing struggle to understand what it means to punish people justly, to acknowledge what has gotten badly wrong, and to reform those wrongs at a pace that history rarely finds satisfying. The debate was not resolved in 1999. It has not been resolved since. It may be the nature of this particular question that it never fully resolves, but only advances slowly, in fits and starts, driven by the testimony of people who suffered, the work of people who fought, and the gradual, incomplete, imperfect expansion of the circle who counts as a person deserving of care. That is neither a comfortable conclusion nor an inspiring one. It is, as far as this particular historian can tell, an honest one. You have stayed with this for a long time. The history is in you now. The way history always is when you have spent time with it seriously. The chain gangs and the death chambers and the reform school hallways and the hospital wards and the solitary cells and the prison farms and the courtrooms where everything was decided in 6 minutes. You have carried it with you through all the chapters. It is heavy. It is supposed to be heavy. The weight is part of the truth of it. And now you can set it down. Not permanently. The history does not go away when you set it down. It waits for you the way history always waits, patient and specific, available whenever you are ready to pick it up again and think about it more. But tonight, you can set it down. The room you are in right now is the room you know. The sounds around you, the ordinary sound of your life. The settling of the building if it is old, the hum of whatever appliances are running, the distant traffic if you're near a road, the quiet if you're in a quiet place. None of those sounds belong to a Georgia chain gang, or an Alabama courtroom, or a California death row. You are here. The century we spent tonight is over. It happened. It shaped the country you live in ways that are still being worked out. The people who lived through the things we described tonight were real people, not illustrations of historical principles, but actual human beings who woke up every morning in those conditions and navigated each day as best they could, and many of whom survived to tell about it, and some of whom did not. We owe them the honesty of looking directly at what happened. We have done that tonight. The weight of it can settle now. Slowly. The way things settle when you are finally still enough to let them. The images can go soft around the edges the way things do in the hours before sleep. The chain and the chain gang road, softening. The stone prison walls, softening. The courtroom and the chair and the sealed chamber and the reform school hallway and the hospital grounds and the dungeon and the solitary cell, all of it softening at the edges, becoming the shapes of history, rather than the urgency of experience. You have been a thoughtful traveler through difficult country. You came here curious, and you stayed through the whole story. That is not a small thing. History is difficult and important, and it rewards the people who are willing to sit with it rather than rush through it. Your breathing is slower than it was at the beginning. The blanket, if you have one, is exactly the right weight. The darkness is a comfortable darkness, a room you know. You did honest work tonight. The kind that requires something of you. Rest now. The century is over. The reckoning continues, as it always does, quietly, in the ongoing work of people who looked at what happened and decided it deserved better. That work will still be there when you wake up. For now, everything can wait. Sleep well. We will see you in the next one.